Good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend, Director of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy here at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation by the winner of the 5th Annual Levin Center Award for Excellence in Oversight Research, Professor Claire Leavitt of Smith College. I'd like to start with a word about the Award for Excellence in Oversight Research. The Levin Center established this award in 2020 to recognize important contributions to the emerging field of oversight research. At the Levin Center, we believe that the first job of a lawmaker in Congress or a state capitol is to be the eyes and voice of their constituents. In other words, to conduct oversight, to get to the heart of important public questions and share those findings for the good, in good faith, with the American people and for the good of all. As our founder and namesake, the late Carl Levin said, quote, "You can't have good government without good oversight." These days, unquote, more and more, we are convinced that the same holds true for democracy. So to understand this critically important process, to help us measure the quality of legislative oversight and understand its impact and how it can be improved, we need to attract scholars to this field and recognize those who are making important contributions. So that is what the Levin Center Award for Excellence in Oversight Research is all about. Each year, a selection committee comprised of faculty members from Wayne State University Law School, Wayne State's Political Science Department, members of the Levin Center staff, and occasionally scholars from other institutions review submissions of not yet published scholarly work that address significant legislative oversight issues at the national, state, local, or even international level. We accept submissions on a rolling basis beginning in January until June of each year. And for additional information about the award, please visit our website, levin-center.org, or at the URL that's I think we're going to be posting in the chat. There you can also read the work of prior award winners and watch video of their presentations of their work. Now let me introduce our award winner and presenter, Professor Claire Leavitt, and our discussant and moderator, Zack Schram. Claire Leavitt is an assistant professor of government at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Her research focuses on congressional oversight and investigations of both the executive branch and non-government organizations. Her work has appeared in journals such as the Political Science Quarterly and the Forum, and her work has been supported by the Project on Government Oversight and the Levin Center. Zack Schram will serve as our discussant, and he will moderate the Q&A with this year's award winner. Zack is a national security and investigations attorney with nearly 2 decades of experience in congressional oversight and strategic response. He spent over a decade in senior roles at the Homeland Security Committee in the United States Senate and the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. He led bipartisan inquiries into financial, national security, and corporate governance issues. He later served as Chief of Investigations and Strategic Response in the CIA's Office of General Counsel. Zack is a graduate of the University of Michigan and Northwestern Law. And with that, let me turn things over to Professor Leavitt. Congratulations, Professor Leavitt. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that introduction. I will just share my screen here, and hopefully that goes without any incident. There we go. I hope everyone can see my screen. And yeah, thank you again, Jim. I'm so happy to be here and so honored to have won this year's Award for Excellence in Oversight Research. The paper I will be presenting today has recently been published in the Forum, an academic journal that specializes in research on contemporary American politics. And I've provided the full citation here for anyone who is interested. Now, there is, of course, a very robust academic literature on the myriad ways in which Trump has flouted longstanding rules and upended norms, and a whole host of scholars have focused on the ways that Trump has marginalized Congress, of course, a constitutionally co-equal branch of government. But when I began work on this paper, I really wanted to home in on how Trump affected one specific congressional power, one that has informed my research agenda for the past several years and is, of course, also the bread and butter of the Levin Center. And that's Congress's power to conduct oversight of other political institutions, including and especially the executive branch. So I'll pause here for just a quick definition. Throughout my paper and throughout this presentation, I will be using the term oversight pretty broadly as a sort of umbrella term to refer to three primary activities that Congress engages in. The first is what oversight scholars tend to call police patrol oversight, and that is the preemptive monitoring of institutional behavior, checking in on how programs and organizations are functioning and whether laws are being implemented according to congressional preferences and intent. Second, oversight, as I will use it, also refers to post hoc investigations of waste, fraud, and abuse in political institutions. This is what oversight scholars usually refer to as fire alarm oversight. And finally, the part of oversight that tends to be ignored a little bit in the literature is the assessment of issues, fact-finding on specific policy areas. And these investigations of issues are not tied to specific pieces of legislation, but they certainly help inform future policy solutions, both inside and outside of Congress. I also want to make it clear that Congress doesn't just conduct oversight of the executive branch. Congress's oversight responsibilities extend to all political institutions. Yes, executive branch agencies, but also non-government organizations, both for-profit companies and nonprofit organizations, state and local governments, foreign governments and international institutions, individuals, the federal court system, and even Congress itself, although that happens pretty rarely. And I began writing this paper in late 2022. So I say that because it did not, at that point, it had not seriously occurred to me that Trump might return to the White House. So my paper very intentionally focused just on Trump's first term and the lessons we can glean from those 4 years. I do have some ideas about how congressional oversight might change and has changed already in the second Trump term. I'll save that for the end of the presentation, and we'll of course be happy to discuss that in the Q&A. But for now, this paper focuses just on Trump's first term and on 4 primary lessons for oversight scholars and practitioners from Trump's first term. So the first lesson is, I think arguably the most optimistic. It's the more things change, the more they stay the same. This quotation here is from an interview I did with a senior oversight staffer in the House, and I think really effectively sums up how committees approached their oversight responsibilities during Trump's first term, and particularly once Democrats regained control of the House in the 2018 midterm elections. So again, I won't repeat the quotation for you. You can read it yourself. But the idea is that, yes, the tenor of investigative work was ratcheted up, but Congress's oversight tools, the way committees conducted their oversight work on a day-to-day basis, did not fundamentally change. What about partisan incentives, right? We know that partisan polarization has increased over, some will say the past 30 years, others will say it really began, more than half a century ago, right? But we know that polarization has increased. And we also know that Congress's oversight work has become more partisan as polarization between the two major parties has increased. The political science research has confirmed over and over again that under divided government, that's when Congress is controlled by the president's opposition, committees conduct more investigations targeted at the executive branch. Whereas under united government, co-partisan committees tend to leave their president alone, right? They don't investigate the executive branch nearly as much. House committees in particular are kind of these mini fiefdoms, right? The majority controls the gavel, and thus the majority controls whether a committee holds a hearing or issues a legally enforceable subpoena for information. And because we know that investigations targeted at the executive branch, investigations of the administration, depress the president's public standing, we can see that the incentives for investigating the administration more under divided government and less under united government are pretty clear. But Trump was a precedent-breaking president in so many ways. And so I really wanted to answer the question, did Trump upend the norms that have governed the oversight process specifically? Oversight is performed by Congress, yes, but its effectiveness, how well it works, depends on the targets of those investigations actually turning over documents and testifying to committees. So I chose to compare Congress's oversight activity as well as the administration's responsiveness to oversight requests under the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, versus the administration of his direct predecessor, Barack Obama. And in order to do that, I want to say a few things about the original data that I drew upon for this project. The data I use include all non-legislative hearings, so all oversight hearings, held by all standing committees in the House and Senate under the first 3 years of the Obama administration versus the first 3 years of the Trump administration. And I compare the first 3 years only because, well, the fourth year of the Trump administration was 2020, and including the year that the world shut down would not paint a very accurate picture and wouldn't be quite fair. So I built the data set using Congressional ProQuest, and the data were then hand coded according to a few things. So first was institutional target, right? As I taught, what kind of institution, executive agency, foreign government, state and local government, et cetera, did the hearing examine? And second, the hearings were all hand-coded according to the focus of the investigation. So did the hearing address new executive policy, new policy coming from the executive branch? Did it monitor existing programs and organizational functions, i.e. was it considered police patrol oversight? Did the hearing follow up on reports from government watchdogs like the Government Accountability Office or agency inspectors general? So I'll walk you through a few figures here. Figure 1 presents the raw number of all oversight hearing days held by standing committees in the House and Senate. The House here is in purple and the Senate is in yellow. And as expected, based on, again, what we know from existing literature, the amount of oversight overall did dwindle from the Obama to the Trump administrations. And committees did also hold more hearings under divided government than under united government. And just keep in mind that in these charts, the only instances of divided government are the House in 2011 and the House in 2019. In all other cases, the chamber was controlled by co-partisans of the president, so members of the president's own party. And so you can see the jump in overall oversight activity in 2019 compared with 2017 and 2018 under unified government. Figure 2 shows you just the hearings that targeted the executive branch. And again, you can see compared to figure 1, that's all oversight activity, and figure 2 is just the hearings that focused on the executive branch. The patterns don't really change. Again, fewer hearings under Trump than under Obama overall, and a spike in hearings after that shift in the House from united to divided government in 2011 and in 2019. Figure 3 here breaks down the data on executive targeted hearings just a little bit more. And what's interesting here is that the partisan patterns that we expect don't actually show up in hearings that monitor the implementation of laws and the functioning of programs, police patrol oversight, which you can see in panel 1 here. Nor do the kind of typical partisan patterns of, more hearings under divided government and fewer under united, nor do those patterns show up in panel 3, the panel that shows kind of the hearings that followed up on watchdog reports. Republicans actually held more hearings following up on reports from government watchdogs. And again, that includes GAO, agency inspectors general, the Congressional Budget Office and the Congressional Research Service, as well as independent commissions. Right? Republicans held more hearings following up on those reports in 2017, 2018 than Democrats did under divided government in 2019. But where we really see the expected partisan patterns is in panel 2, and the number of hearings that focus on new executive policy. So when an executive agency issues a new rule or the president issues an executive order, committees examine those new policies far more under divided government, the House in 2011 and the House in 2019, than under united government. So this slide really just summarizes everything I just went through, in quicker, more digestible form. But the lesson here so far is that committees are still doing meaningful oversight work. If an agency inspector general issues a report on an instance of waste, fraud, and abuse within that agency, committees will follow up on it, even if their party's president is in the White House. But where they tend to back off is holding the president's feet to the fire over new policy issued by that president's administration. But then the question becomes, all right, well, we know what Congress is doing. Again, those tools don't really change. Congress is still grinding along, conducting its oversight obligations and responsibilities. But how is the administration actually responding? Again, good oversight depends on actually getting the information you request from your targets. So I also wanted to compare the Trump administration's responsiveness to his direct predecessor's responsiveness. And I measure responsiveness in this paper by the number of witnesses from executive branch agencies that testified before committees per hearing day. And this, controls for the fact that fewer hearings were held overall under Trump than under Obama. And also the number of agency directors that testified per hearing day. And this analysis, I should note, is limited only to hearings that targeted the executive branch. And what the data show is that Trump was less responsive to committees in terms, again, of his provision of administration witnesses than Obama was. All right, so again, House data here is in black, Senate data is in yellow, and figure 4 tells you, the number of all agency witnesses at all levels that testified per executive targeted hearing day, and then figure 5 is the number of agency directors. And I can, go back to these, to these figures at any point, during the Q&A, but in summary, what they show is that Trump was less responsive to his opponents, to House Democrats, than Obama was to his opponents, House Republicans. But Trump was also less responsive to his fellow Republicans than Obama was to fellow Democrats. So what we can take from this is that Trump wasn't just being intransigent because, as he claimed repeatedly in 2019, that Democrats were on a witch hunt and were kind of spending taxpayer money on baseless investigations. Right, because in fact, he was less responsive even to Republicans than Obama was to Democrats. So Trump made it harder for both parties to access information from the executive branch. And this was a problem for Congress, as I will talk about, a little bit later on. But the second lesson that I really underscore in the paper is that while investigations of the executive branch tend to get the most attention, it's immediately where people's minds go when they think oversight. Committees also investigate other institutions as well, as I've pointed out, for-profit companies, nonprofit organizations, state and local governments, foreign governments. And so when they regained control of the House in 2018, Democrats made it very clear that while they would, of course, investigate Trump, they wouldn't only investigate Trump. The primary oversight committee in the House even changed its name from Committee on Oversight and Government Reform to just the Committee on Oversight and Reform, precisely to emphasize that government was not its only focus. And so here is, let me just go, there we go, to jump to the next figure to show you the data on committee hearings that focus on other executive targets. So not executive agencies, but foreign governments, non-government organizations, that includes both for-profit and nonprofit organizations, and state and local government. And panel 2, as you can see, is all the hearings that focus exclusively on non-government organizations. And what we see is that overall, Democrats hold more hearings on non-government organizations than do Republicans in both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And I also suggest in the paper that when committees conducted this non-government focused oversight under Trump, those investigations were more likely to gain bipartisan support, to compel information from the institutional target, and also to lead to the desired policy change. All this is compared with more, quote unquote, classic investigations of the executive branch. Now, my paper relies on case studies to make this argument, and I'm actually currently working on a larger project that expands this argument and tests these hypotheses across a much broader swath of data, asking, is oversight focused on non-government organizations more effective in these ways than executive branch targeted oversight? But this paper really makes the argument and kind of provides the foundation for the future research that I'm going to do, that Democrats under Trump were more effective at getting their desired outcomes when they focused on non-government organizations rather than the Trump administration. In the second half of the paper, moving on to the third of 4 lessons that I delineate in my work, in the second half of the paper, I make the argument that Trump strategically used the federal judiciary as a way to marginalize Congress, and specifically to expose Congress's limited ability to enforce its own investigative powers. So just timeline-wise, in April of 2019, this was 4 months into divided government in Trump's first term, Trump announced he was going to fight all subpoenas coming from the Democratic-controlled House. And at the end of the summer, Democrats initiated their impeachment investigation of Trump. This was the investigation after Trump's, quote unquote, perfect phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky, in which Trump threatened to withhold congressionally appropriated aid unless Zelensky opened an investigation into Hunter Biden. Feels like a million years ago, but that was Trump's first impeachment and acquittal. He was, impeached by the House in December of 2019 and acquitted by the Senate in January of 2020. And in September of 2019, Trump made the announcement that he simply would not cooperate on the impeachment investigation in any way. And so after his acquittal, I really want to draw your attention to this quotation from Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. This was, in response to the Senate's refusal to allow additional witnesses to testify during Trump's trial in the Senate. Think of the impeachment as an indictment and the Senate's consideration as a trial. And, Senator Murphy said, I don't know why a president would ever honor a subpoena after this. I think what we have signed off on is the future irrelevance of any congressional oversight of the executive branch. And so that brings us to really the biggest question when we're talking about oversight powers is how can Congress actually enforce compliance with its requests for information? Well, they can issue subpoenas, right? Every committee in Congress has had the ability to do this since 1974. And if a witness decides to defy a subpoena, Congress can hold him in contempt and pass either a civil or a criminal contempt resolution. But the key is contempt resolutions then have to be enforced. And criminal contempt is enforced by the Justice Department. The Justice Department has to make a decision to prosecute the contemptible person. Civil contempt resolutions, wend their way through the federal court system and are enforceable by federal judges. So again, Congress can pass a contempt resolution, but they don't have the ability to actually enforce them. What else can Congress do? Well, impeachment and removal of executive officers is certainly a relevant power that Congress has to enforce its will, but impeachment and removal were intended to be at the time of the framing and still are very rare. And they can't be deployed as a matter of course every time an administration official decides not to cooperate with Congress. There's also, the Capitol jail. This is, back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. If a chamber of Congress held an official in contempt, the House or Senate sergeant at arms would be able to go arrest that person and bring them down to the jail in the basement of the Capitol. And, whenever I talk about this mode of enforcement, it always elicits, a huge laugh from my students, and rightfully so. I mean, the last time this was done was in 1927, and it's really unthinkable that Congress would enforce contempt resolutions in this way today. And finally, it's worth mentioning that Congress can certainly punish unresponsive agencies with cuts to their budget or by refusing to appropriate money at all, so by shutting down the government. But again, as I think we're all living through right now, this is a pretty risky strategy, and it doesn't actually solve the immediate problem, which is we need testimony and information from X, Y, and Z executive official, and we're not getting it. So the point here is that really to reliably enforce subpoenas, and in turn, if it comes to that contempt resolutions, you've got to go to court. And the problem there is that historically, the courts have really taken a hands-off approach to legislative executive disputes. The Supreme Court has affirmed Congress's oversight powers over and over again, but it is also very reluctant and has been very reluctant to be the mediator, to actually settle disputes between the legislative and executive branches. In many cases, the court has simply instructed Congress and the administration to negotiate, to work things out. The Supreme Court has not yet ruled on, whether under which conditions executive privilege claims would be legitimate in, justifying defying congressional subpoenas. So again, the overall lesson here is that Congress cannot rely on the courts to reliably and consistently enforce their subpoenas. And so the argument I make in the paper is that by routinely refusing to cooperate with Congress from the get-go, Trump forced Congress to turn to the courts more and more to enforce compliance with committees' requests for information. And simultaneously, at the same time, Trump began remaking the federal judiciary, ensuring that all open seats went to Federalist Society-approved judges. I'll give you this chart here, comes from the Pew Research Center, and it shows that Trump appointed almost as many appeals court judges in one term than Obama did in two. And way more judges overall than the most recent one-term president, which was George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993. And for those who are curious about the Biden administration, which I don't include here, Biden actually just edged out Trump's total for total number of federal judges appointed in just one term. So, the courts were certainly not spared Trump's institutional attacks. I want to be clear on that. Since the Obama years, Republicans have been speaking publicly about the possibility of just defying federal court decisions that they don't agree with. And here, I give you some examples I talked about in the paper. Most recently, Trump's now Vice President, J.D. Vance, said, of course, famously that Trump should, quote, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Not really evidence that Jackson ever said that, but nevertheless, that's often used as a way to point out that, well, Congress may not be able to enforce its own powers, but neither is the court, right? That both other branches rely on the executive branch to enforce their decisions. And what I want to make clear is that this, other Republicans, what this shows is that other Republicans anticipated that a Trump administration would run into resistance from the courts. And I argue we're kind of setting the stage for a fight. And Trump did run into resistance from the courts during his first term. Federal courts ruled against the Trump administration 192 times and in his favor just 54. But while Trump explicitly refused to cooperate with congressional investigations, he did grudgingly abide by court decisions. I say grudgingly because Trump did publicly kind of flirt with the idea of just ignoring court decisions. One of the examples of a few I talk about in my paper is in June 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that the administration could not add a question to the short form census asking whether the respondent was a U.S. citizen. And on Twitter, Trump kind of, mulled over printing the census forms with the citizenship question included anyway. And after about a week of uncertainty and back and forth, Trump finally announced that, yes, the administration would comply with the Supreme Court's decision. And again, this is just one example of a few of Trump's publicly recognizing and acquiescing to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, even when he made it clear that he disagreed with its decision. And it's important that at the exact same time that Trump was saying Congress's inquiries are illegitimate, he's saying the exact opposite about the court. Now, whether Trump did this intentionally or unintentionally, I think, is of secondary importance to the effects of this behavior, right? Trump was saying the courts can check me, but Congress cannot, thus kind of establishing the judiciary as a co-equal branch and Congress as an institutional inferior. And again, this particular rebalancing of powers was happening at the same time that Trump was doing his level best to appoint ideological allies to all levels of the federal judiciary, setting the conditions for future wins in court. So the question then becomes, well, how do we apply these lessons to Trump's second term, to where we are now? So I'll say a little bit about this before, and of course, I'm happy to discuss this more in the Q&A. I have been tracking all oversight activity of both houses of Congress since the beginning of this year, and committees are still conducting oversight, right? Those tools haven't really changed. A broad sweep of the data, this is still, pretty raw, but so far, these are the issues that, Republicans in the Republican-controlled House and Senate are spending the most time on, right? As you might expect, especially at the beginning of the year, there was a lot on Biden-Harris administration policies, including the former administration's approach to immigration border security, a lot of investigations of anti-Semitism and threats to free speech on college campuses. A lot of work on China, on unfair Chinese trade practices, Chinese influence on the federal workforce and on universities. The House established a select committee on the, quote, strategic competition between the US and the Chinese Communist Party. They've been paying a lot of attention to cybersecurity, to, how to modernize government technology and data security, how to prepare government and broader society for artificial intelligence, specific data breaches and lax security. And then also there's been some pretty in-depth work on prescription drug pricing and the functioning of government discount price programs to ensure that lower income people can have access to affordable prescription drugs through Medicaid. So that's what Congress has been doing thus far over the past 10 months. So there's still, the House and Senate are both controlled by Trump's partisan allies, but they're still doing their work. The gears are still grinding. What can we expect from Trump himself and from the Trump administration? Well, if Democrats win back either chamber of Congress in the 2026 midterm elections, I think we can say it's pretty likely that Trump will, as he did in his first term, refuse to cooperate with investigations from a Democrat-led House or, less likely, a Democrat-led Senate starting in 2027. We can also say, I think, fairly, that the courts are more inclined to rule in Trump's favor this time around. There are simply more Trump allies in the federal judiciary now than there were in Trump's first term. And, of course, Trump also appointed 3 Supreme Court justices during his first 4 years. Trump has been a little slower on the, Article 3 appointments this time around. Since taking office in January of this year, Trump has appointed and the Senate has confirmed 8 federal judges. This data is as of October 1st. And this is, well below the average of 17 for previous presidents the first year of their second term. So we'll see how that trend, where that trend line continues to go. But so far, he hasn't been quite as prolific as previous second-term presidents have been. And it's also worth mentioning that in his second term, Trump has consistently and right from the jump appealed to the Supreme Court for emergency actions when lower court judges have put holds on new executive policy. And the Supreme Court has ruled in Trump's favor almost every time. So ruling that the policy in question can go into effect until the kind of litigation process and the case is wending its way through the federal court system is complete. So this so-called shadow docket, as legal scholars call it, of cases under emergency review certainly isn't the final word on the issues at hand. But as we all know, at a practical level, even if the Supreme Court were to rule against Trump later on, it's really hard to unscramble an egg, right? The damage on stuff like the dismantling of federal agencies, firing of federal employees, ICE raids and deportations, right? They can't be easily undone. But speaking about oversight powers specifically, will the courts be less inclined to defend Congress's oversight powers in Trump's second term? And that's a trickier one because, as I've said, historically, the court has been pretty reluctant to play mediator in executive legislative disputes. And so I'm a little bit more hesitant to make predictions about how the courts are going to defend oversight powers if and when Trump is in a position to defy Democratic subpoenas. But if the past is any indication, the courts will not jump at the chance to play mediator here. And what we may see as a result is just the further marginalization of Congress and the laying bare of its inability to enforce its own powers. So I will stop there and turn things over to Zack. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation and for your outstanding paper, which resonates with me and I imagine with many of us who've spent years inside the oversight process. Just a programming note, we would love to see questions in the Q&A box. So to our many participants, please do not be shy and just go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A box. As someone who's conducted, overseen, and responded to congressional investigations for the better part of 2 decades, I'm grateful that you've chosen this field as a topic of academic inquiry. I'm sure I speak for many of the practitioners present today in reflecting that your paper provides hard data and analysis that elucidates and contextualizes the recent and intensifying challenges those of us in this line of work experience, particularly in this era of partisan investigations and the increasing marginalization of Congress. I also want to express appreciation to the Levin Center and to Jim and Margot for their leadership in advancing bipartisan fact-based oversight. And I want to acknowledge with deep gratitude Senator Carl Levin and Elise Bean of blessed memory. When I went to work for Carl and Elise out of law school, I was warned that no matter where my career went, I would never find a better job. Their example still defines what congressional investigations can and should be: patient, rigorous, disciplined, bipartisan, and devoted to the facts. I was delighted to see in your paper, Claire, multiple references to Carl and Elise's article in the Wayne Law Review. I come to this discussion not as an academic, but as a practitioner. I've seen investigations from both sides of the dais, from the committee, from the private sector, and from within the executive branch. Your paper captures the complexity of congressional oversight, its power, its limitations, and as we continue to learn, its fragility. I fear that you've hit the nail on the head in your observation that broad-reaching claims of executive privilege and defiance of subpoenas, quote, acutely threaten the oversight process by laying bare the extent to which effective oversight depends upon the cooperation and commitment of the other 2 branches of the federal government. End quote. As you write, quote, prolonged court battles stall meaningful progress on congressional investigations, rendering the classic tools of oversight less effective. Efforts to gum up the functionality of the Constitution's system of checks and balances only underscore the legislature's comparative weakness. End quote. I would add to your analysis the additional challenge posed by the growth of the administrative state that is more technically complex and self-protective than ever, while congressional capacity has remained flat. All of the Senate's full-time investigators could fit into a single Senate anteroom. A handful of committee staff members must oversee agencies with tens or hundreds of thousands of employees, large legal offices, and entire teams devoted to managing oversight. And executive branch intransigence only compounds that resource gap. Investigations operate through a mix of law, committee rules, norms, and precedent, a delicate architecture of authority. Enforcing requests, especially against resistant or intransigent respondents, takes time, coordination, and persistence. And as your paper addresses, that delicate authority is undermined by partisanship, which too often renders Congress too divided to effectively assert its own institutional interests. A committee acting in concert to enforce its investigative prerogatives has a larger toolkit and far more leverage. I think of that as the Levin-Coburn model of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, after Carl and Oklahoma conservative Tom Coburn, with whom Carl had little in common beyond their professional integrity and a shared determination to find the facts. Their bipartisanship wasn't ornamental. It was substantive, procedural, and functional. In the PSI conference room, committee staff spoke with one voice. That unity created the trust and shared ownership necessary to withstand pressure, earn public credibility, and compel agency cooperation. This model may be out of fashion, but in my opinion, it's unsurpassed. I'm grateful that the Levin Center remains its strongest advocate and educator. And that brings me to the question that stayed with me as I read your paper, Claire, with its precise and frankly painful account of Congress's inability to enforce its oversight prerogatives. As you were writing this, did you mean for your analysis to be limited to investigative marginalization, or were you perhaps foreshadowing Congress's broader retreat as a co-equal branch of government? Because the picture that you paint strikes me not just as an oversight problem, but as a constitutional warning light. And with that, I'll stop and turn to you, Claire, for your thoughts, and then open it up for audience discussion. One more reminder, please, for the participants to put questions into the Q&A. And thank you, Claire. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Zach. You know, I'm to answer your question, yes, my intent was to focus just on oversight. That's my area of expertise, and writing a paper on the many other ways Trump has marginalized Congress would require a book, and it's also, you know, been done quite a bit by fellow scholars, and so I really wanted to focus on just oversight powers and how Trump has endangered those. Now, that said, I think I don't want to say it's, well, I focus just on oversight powers, of course, because oversight is a huge part of what Congress does, as we all know. And one of the reasons that even when I was defining oversight at the beginning of my presentation, that I said, you know, it's not just, oh, waste, fraud, and abuse in the executive branch or police patrol monitoring of agencies, but it's also how Congress gathers information that will then inform its legislative efforts. And so all of these hearings that Congress holds that, you know, they may not be focused on a specific piece of legislation, but they absolutely are focused on policy making. And so I think, you know, while I just focused on oversight powers in this paper, the lessons for Congress's institutional legitimacy as a whole are pretty profound. And, you know, I think that I'll also say I think that's really where the biggest concerns about, you know, Trump's obliterating of rules and norms really come from. And I'll say, and maybe this is a slightly unpopular opinion, but I don't think it's all that shocking that we see a unified Congress pass policies that Trump wants, right? This is not new. It happens under every instance of unified government. It obviously happened under the first 2 years of the Biden administration when government was unified, when Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress as well. So, for instance, the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act doesn't concern me quite as much as, you know, what would happen if Democrats take control of the House and then Trump starts defying subpoenas, right? That Congress would want to enact the president's policy agenda makes sense because the parties are very ideologically polarized, and Republicans in Congress do have the same kind of policy preferences and ideological predilections that Trump has. So their policy agenda, and that's kind of conforming to what Trump wants, absolutely does not surprise me, and I don't think is really a problem for democracy, if you will. But Trump's defying congressional subpoenas and, you know, pressure campaigns for, you know, the Senate and certain members of the Senate to confirm unqualified executive branch nominees, that's a different story. And so I would say that my paper, yes, it focuses just on oversight, but the implications are really monumental, I think, for looking at Congress's institutional legitimacy as a whole and its role as a co-equal branch of government.
Yeah, I know when we spoke earlier, you said you don't always like to make predictions, but I did find your paper to be quite predictive. Turning to the Q&A, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Doesn't the power of oversight really come down to the character and commitment of the members of Congress to upholding their authority to do oversight? Any procedural problem can be dispelled if the members and leadership of Congress, regardless of party, want to hold the executive branch accountable.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I mean, I certainly think there's more Congress could be doing. But as I said, like the reason, for instance, that I spent so much time kind of going over how Congress can enforce compliance with subpoenas during my presentation is to say that they have used those tools, right? Congress has now shut the government down. No, it's not in this case to enforce compliance with subpoenas or enforce, or punish the administration for defying a subpoena, but nevertheless, it is demonstrative of the power that Congress has to make life difficult for the executive branch. Now, I don't want to say we know exactly what the effects of this shutdown are going to be, but thus far, it doesn't really seem to be doing much to constrain the executive. So Congress does try these things, right? Congress impeached Trump twice, and both times he was acquitted by the Senate. Now, yes, could the Senate have found a little bit more backbone or just certainly, again, ignored partisan incentives to, perhaps consider the case on its merits? Again, this is assuming that they did not already do that. Sure. And yes, a lot of the onus is on members of the House and Senate to not just give in to the most popular member of their party, who is Donald Trump at this point. He's not widely popular, but I think it's fair to say he's more popular than Republicans in Congress. Sure, but my point is, especially under divided government in Trump's first term, Democrats did push back. And they did hold very high-ranking executive officials in contempt. William Barr and the Attorney General and the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. And ultimately, it just didn't really matter because Congress was still not able to get the information that they needed. One way I will say in which Congress can obviate the executive branch's intransigence is, if the circumstances permit it, Congress could always try to get that information from the private sector instead. And in fact, this is exactly what Democrats on the Hill did in 2019 when they wanted to get access to Trump's tax returns, rather than, dealing with Trump himself or even with the Trump organization. They went to Mazars LLP and to private firms that are a lot less willing to be held in contempt and defy subpoenas than the Trump administration was. So that was one way around the Trump administration's intransigence. But again, that really depends on the circumstances. If you can get that information from the private sector, great, because again, they will be more responsive. But if you can't, we've seen what happens when Congress exercises its enforcement powers. And the answer is, well, not all that much, unfortunately.
Turning to a multi-part question from Claudine Brenner, herself a Senate investigator. I'll ask it in parts. When determining the target of committee oversight, is it based on only, this is about your data, to clarify. When determining the target of committee oversight, is it based on only on witness, i.e. non-government administration official, or based on the specific hearing subject? She asks because it seems fairly common for committees to hold hearings about an executive branch program or policy, but with non-governmental witnesses, whistleblowers, good government groups, etc.
Absolutely. Great question. And I would have loved to elaborate more on the data, but we would have been here all day. I will say yes. So I don't, the hearings were not hand-coded according to witness affiliation, but rather to the hearing title and the hearing descriptions, which is one of the reasons I use Congressional ProQuest, because the hearing descriptions provided by the committees themselves often run, 2 or 3 paragraphs. They're very in-depth. And it was based on those descriptions as well as the hearing titles that the hearings were coded according to institutional target. And it was very common, of course, for a hearing to target not just one, but multiple types of institutions. And that's partly why, and I can go back to these figures if you like, but I'll just describe them. When you look at all of the hearings held by committees during the first 3 years of Obama versus Trump, and then you look at the executive targeted hearings, they're really executive targeted hearings make up about 80% of all hearings held by committees, and about 20% are exclusively focused on other types of institutions. So great question. No hearing in my database focused on more than 4 institutional targets, but you're absolutely right that a lot of hearings will target the executive branch as well as a nonprofit institution or a for-profit company. And that, of course, was accounted for during the coding process.
So continuing that line of questioning, for oversight where the executive branch is the target, have you distinguished between oversight of the current administration versus the previous one? You touched on the fact that some recent congressional oversight is focused on the Biden administration. Anecdotally, I think Claudine thinks that the practice of oversight targeting the past administration during times of party alignment between the president and Congress has been increasing, but she'd be curious whether your data bears that out.
Absolutely. Great question. Yes, the political science research has shown that there's usually a big sort of quick spike in the early months of a new Congress when there's a power shift. So after a president's opposition regains control of either the House or Senate, there's or rather, let me start over. When there's a new administration and a new Congress, there's a spike in the number of investigations in the first few months that focus on the previous administration. So essentially, they're still kind of saying, well, yes, we have a new president, but we're still concerned with what the previous administration was doing. So that is absolutely true. My data absolutely bear that out. I don't present that data in this paper simply because it wasn't immediately relevant to the point I was making. But I will point out that when I showed the partisan patterns, the spikes in investigations of new executive policy that really follows the partisan patterns that we would expect. Those hearings were coded to, according to whether the hearing addressed new executive policy. So executive policy, executive orders, agency rules that were initiated during the current administration and not the previous one. And so I did that very deliberately, precisely to avoid, as I said, that initial spike when you see a transition and a new president comes in, new administration, and you see that Congress, especially if Congress is our partisan opponents of the previous administration, that they'll immediately start looking into, well, the previous administration did this on its way out the door, and here it's still kind of dealing with controversies from the previous administration. That usually dies down after the first few months, and my data explicitly controlled for that by only looking at does this hearing address new executive policy, so under the current administration.
Thank you for that explanation. We have 2 questions in the chat about the inherent contempt power, one from an anonymous attendee and one from Jeremy. And they both ask about whether or not you could return to using the Sergeant at Arms or the Capitol Police to enforcing Congress's inherent contempt powers.
I mean, you could do it. Actually, back in 2019, Speaker Pelosi kind of wryly mentioned it, she was joking, of course, but she said, look, we do have a jail down in the basement, and that's always an option available to us. So absolutely, Congress would be empowered to do it, I think. And, I would expect a court challenge, of course, from the administration if that were to happen. But sure, Congress could absolutely try it. It just, realistically speaking, as I said, it hasn't happened since 1927. And I won't, go into the details of this, but some of the political ramifications from, cases in the early 20th century and the 19th century when that did happen, it was a bad look. And I think it would be kind of politically infeasible for that reason today. I think it would be seen as sort of a circus-like stunt, even if that's not quite fair. I think that's how it would be perceived. And the fact that it's been almost 100 years since it's last been used, I think fairly, rules out Congress's, the probability that Congress will use that power in the future. But never say never. I've been wrong before. So I would love to see them try it personally.
Continuing on the theme of other ways Congress can exert leverage over its enforcement oversight prerogatives. We have an anonymous question about Congress's wide-ranging power to limit the jurisdiction of the federal courts to play a role in bolstering their ability to conduct oversight of the executive branch, especially when the members of the judiciary might be more sympathetic to executive branch policies preferences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if you kind of if you could rephrase or repeat that. I just want to make sure I'm getting it right.
Whether or not Congress can use its leverage over limiting the jurisdiction of federal courts to better assert its prerogatives.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I assume that refers to, if Congress passes a civil contempt resolution that is intended to enforce compliance with a subpoena, that obviously starts, in the federal trial courts and kind of makes its way through the system. That's a great question, whether Congress could limit the jurisdiction of the federal courts to even consider those things. I guess my response would be, well, what's the alternative? Again, Congress is the jail down in the basement of the Capitol. That is an alternative. I'm just not sure kind of realistically what the alternative would be. And I think certainly given that the executive branch of government is tasked with enforcing the decisions of both Congress, but also the judiciary, I think Congress is probably better served by having civil contempt resolutions kind of be dealt with in the federal court system rather than anywhere else. I guess, yeah, that would be my response is I'm not clear as to what a preferable alternative would be. And I think that's probably, if I had to guess, why Congress wouldn't consider going there.
Another question from Anonymous, and I think you've started to address this previously, but can you talk more about your tracking in terms of policy areas? Was there more oversight in any particular policy arena?
During Trump's first term or during his second, the last 10 months?
Well, why don't we combine those then? Because we
Yeah.
have also received questions about the last 10 months. Have you continued to do oversight tracking, and what have you seen since January? So let's take that in combination.
Great question. Yeah, well, at the end of my presentation, I did kind of go through a few of the policy areas that I have seen the most activity in. And let me clarify, when I say activity, I mean hearings, letters sent from Congress to any institutional target, as well as staff reports. And those tend to be much greater depth delineation of investigative findings that are published either by the full committee or simply by the majority or minority staff. So that's what I mean by oversight activity. The one that has and again, keep in mind, this is unified government. So, Republicans are not taking Trump on in any, explicit or very highly public ways. But as I said, yes, they're doing a lot of work that could be and that has been bipartisan, has garnered bipartisan support, whether it's, member of the minority co-signing a letter or, the minority staff of a committee signing on to a committee report. And that's China is the big one. There seems to be a lot of bipartisan impetus there. The unfair trade practices of the Chinese government, the the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on, people working within the federal government. That's, before at the beginning of this year, the House Oversight Committee was investigating, Tim Walz's potential ties to the Chinese government. That was not one that garnered bipartisan support, and that's an example of kind of the politicization of the China issue. But that has not that kind of overt politicization has not really shown up over the past 10 months. We see a lot of stuff on, as I said, cybersecurity, a lot of focus on colleges and universities, accusations, of anti-Semitism, of, threats to free speech, et cetera. I will say, and I'll say a little bit about where I have seen, again, this is just the raw data. It hasn't been, I haven't really coded it yet. This is just kind of what I'm seeing over the past 10 months. Where there might be opportunities for pushback from Republicans against the Trump administration. And the first is the Trump's firing of agency inspectors general. There's been some pushback, especially from Republicans who really have been, who really take oversight powers of Congress very seriously, like Chuck Grassley of Iowa, for instance. We've seen, the kind of the threat of the government shutdown to SNAP benefits, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act effects on the Medicaid program. We're seeing some Republicans start to get a little bit more willing to at least hold hearings and send letters about how those programs are being affected, even if they themselves were kind of complicit in these policy effects by passing the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And I also want to mention that there actually a paper or a book chapter rather that I published in 2023 with a colleague, Doug Kreiner, really makes the case that foreign policy is the one area that Republicans have been much more willing to push back against Trump in. And we talk about case studies from the first Trump administration, but I think this time around what we're seeing is recently Republicans have started murmuring about Trump's war on, so-called war on the drug cartels and, again, not getting congressional approval for some of these attacks on, Venezuelan targets. So I think there is where I've seen and my previous research has confirmed and what other research has confirmed as well is that foreign policy is the area in which you can probably expect to see the most pushback against Trump's agenda, but it's not the only area. And I think, stay tuned. And really, the reality is that if Trump is unpopular, Republicans will be more willing to investigate him on specific issues. Again, depending on the context, if he gets more popular, they will be less willing. And that is the case for every administration, not just Trump.
So we have about 5 more minutes to take questions and two good questions in the chat. So hope to get to both of them. I'm happy to see so much participation from practitioners, and these last two are from Senate staff. So starting with Victoria K, she writes, hopefully not misquoting, but I think Professor Leavitt mentioned that Democrats were more effective in focusing on non-governmental oversight during the first term. However, refocusing efforts seems to be tone deaf to daily headlines within the public discourse. Is it a better use of taxpayer money to still try and go after the administration or redirect efforts to spaces that are more ripe for impact?
Yeah, great question. And that's a bit of a normative one as well. I think, yeah, and I will say it's not that Democrats didn't go after Trump. They absolutely did. They didn't just go after Trump, though. And I think, what my data showed were that Democrats were more likely than Republicans were to focus on non-government organizations. And when they did, yes, those investigations were more effective according to those metrics I laid out, in terms of bipartisan support, in terms of actually getting what you want from the desired targets, and in terms of affecting policy change. Now, I don't think, certainly normatively speaking, I don't think that means they should just kind of, go where the light is, if you will. That old joke about why are you looking for your keys under the lamp? Well, it's where the light is, right? I don't think that's what Democrats should do or even what they are doing. But it does, I think, give Congress a sheen of legitimacy to be able to say, look, we're not just, our job is not just checking the executive branch, right? Our job is to check other political institutions as well and keep our eye on private sector abuses and on abuses of foreign governments, right? This is just as much a part of our job as checking the Trump administration. So I do think, it's important that if Democrats win back control in the midterms in 2026, they absolutely should not shy away from holding Trump's feet to the fire, but nor should they say we're going to make it all about Trump. And a big reason for that is if you look at public opinion polls, voters don't necessarily want that. Actually, in 2018, right before the midterm elections, voters expressed anxiety, generally speaking, and this is all laid out in my paper, but anxiety that Democrats would spend too much time investigating Congress. And that's something, presidents have always trotted that out as a line of attack, right? Like, oh, they're wasting so much time investigating me, but look, they can't pass budgets on time, et cetera, et cetera. And they can't, Congress can't do anything, but sure, they can always investigate me. And, so I don't think Democrats should back down from that responsibility, but I also think if you want to increase the public trust in the institution of Congress, which has dipped to really horrifyingly low levels, you'll also want to show that A, oversight works, and B, it's not just the administration that oversight work is concerned with.
And a wonderful question to wrap up on from another Senate staffer, Nomi. Did you look into the number of bipartisan versus partisan investigations, and if the number of partisan investigations has increased in recent years?
Great question. I did not do that for this paper, but as it happens, I'm working on another project in which I do look at whether investigations are bipartisan, and I measure bipartisanship as, whether, according to whether a member of the minority has signed on to a letter or if the minority staff has approved a committee staff report. And I don't have the results of that just quite yet. This is still a work in progress. But short answer, no, I didn't consider it for this paper, simply because just looking at hearings, there's no way to really measure bipartisanship since the minority, yes, they can, depending on committee rules, they can usually invite one witness, but majority has gavel control in the House and the Senate. Obviously, the minority has more rights, but across the board, it's just hard to measure bipartisanship when you're just looking at hearings. But in ongoing work, because I look at other types of investigative activity, I do anticipate being able to test, the effectiveness of bipartisan investigations versus more partisan ones in the future.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your wonderful presentation and this very fruitful engagement, and to all the panelists for their wonderful and thoughtful questions. And with the remaining 3 minutes, I know Jim had some words in closing.
Well, really, all I wanted to share was to first congratulate and thank Professor Leavitt for submitting such a wonderful paper, and thank you, Zach, for your excellent job of discussing and moderating some really great questions. I want to thank the audience for participating. One of the things I really got out of this whole discussion, and Claire, your comments particularly, was that that a lot of times I think we think of oversight in too narrow a way, that really oversight encompasses a great deal more than just checking the executive. I think we get caught up in the term checks and balances, and we think that's all oversight is. And at the Leavitt Center, what we really try to convey is that oversight is the kind of quintessential act of representation. If representing someone or some community or constituency is really about gathering and sharing information, that is really what democracy is about. And so it's very important to track where Congress is going with its investigations and how it's being conducted and who it's investigating. But it isn't always about checking or uncovering malfeasance or corruption, which is important. It can also just be about responding to what the people are asking, what the people need to know. What kinds of facts do we need to uncover in order to make progress and build consensus? So I thought this conversation really brought that forward. The last thing I'll say to everyone is, first of all, thank our audience and encourage everybody, if you couldn't stay for the whole event today, or weren't able to be with us, a recording of this discussion is going to appear on our YouTube channel in a day or so, as soon as it's up online. So please come back to levin-center.org to look for it. And then to anyone, particularly obviously scholars in particular, if you're interested in submitting a paper for the annual Levin Center Award for Excellence in Oversight Research, the window for that opens in January, and we accept papers at any point until June of each year. So with that, let me thank both of our distinguished panelists, and thank all of you, and we'll see you again in the near future.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.